An alpha king came begging for milk, and the omega breastfed his pup and became the mother he needed. Snow is falling hard on the high mountain trail when a giant rider staggers to a lonely ranch door, an infant in his arms, blue with cold. The man's voice shakes as he begs for milk. Inside, the rancher's hands tremble. He's buried a child before and swore never to open his heart again. But out there, the wind howls like a pack of wolves, and behind that rider comes something worse than the storm. A badge, a warrant, and a railroad's hunger for land it does not own. One choice could save a child's life. Another could cost him his home, his freedom, maybe his soul. In a land where law bends to gold, where promises are broken with a signature, two men from different worlds must stand together or be torn apart. This channel isn't just about stories, it's about remembering what still holds value, empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The bitter January wind howled across the San Juan Highlands, whipping snow into stinging clouds that scattered across the frozen landscape. Elias Moore's muscles burned as he brought his axe down again and again, methodically splitting logs behind his line shack. His breath came in white puffs in the frigid air as dusk began to settle over the mountains. Through the swirling snow, movement caught his eye. A lone rider materialized from the white haze, wavering in the saddle as his exhausted horse stumbled through the deep drifts. Even from a distance, Elias could see something was wrong in the rider's posture, hunched protective rather than just cold. The stranger drew closer, and Elias's breath caught. The man was massive, well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the bearing of a soldier despite his current state. His skin was a rich bronze beneath the windburn, marking his native heritage. But what drew Elias's attention was the careful way the rider cradled a small bundle against his chest. The horse's legs finally gave out just yards from the cabin, collapsing into the snow with steaming breath. The rider dismounted with surprising grace given his burden, though Elias could see exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "Please!" The man's deep voice cracked with desperation as he approached. "I need milk! My son! He's burning with fever!" His arms shifted, revealing a tiny face within the swaddling, cheeks flushed red against otherwise pale skin. The infant's breathing came in concerning wheezes. Elias felt his heart stutter painfully in his chest. Memories he kept locked away threatened to surface, of another small face, flushed with fever, breath failing as cholera took his own child years ago. The same helplessness that had crushed him then echoed in the stranger's eyes now. For a moment, Elias hesitated. Opening his door to strangers was dangerous in these mountains, especially to a man who clearly had trouble on his trail. But the whimpered cry from the bundle broke through his reservations. "Come inside," Elias said gruffly, already moving to open the cabin door. "I've got a goat in the shed that's nursing. Get warm by the fire while I fetch her." Relief crashed across the stranger's weathered features as he ducked through the doorway. Elias quickly stoked the dying embers in the potbelly stove, adding fresh logs until flames crackled to life. The tall man, who could only be the infamous King Hawk that Elias had heard whispered about in town, sank to his knees beside the warmth, still clutching his son close. "Thank you," King murmured, his deep voice rough with emotion. "We've ridden hard for 3 days. The fever started yesterday. I couldn't lose him, too." The unspoken grief in those words told Elias this man had already lost someone dear, likely the child's mother. Another echo of his own past that made his chest ache. Without responding, Elias pulled on his heavy coat and pushed back out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he fought his way to the small shed. Inside, his nursing nanny goat bleated a greeting, her kid sleeping nearby. With practiced movements, Elias gathered her up, wrapping her in an old blanket before carrying her through the snow to the cabin. When he returned, King had unwrapped the infant slightly in the warmth. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old, with a shock of black hair and fever-bright eyes that struggled to focus. His little chest worked too hard for each breath. Elias settled the goat near the fire, keeping her calm with practiced hands, as King carefully brought his son close. The baby's pitiful cry strengthened slightly at the smell of milk, and with gentle guidance, he latched onto the goat's teat. The cabin filled with the sound of eager suckling. King's massive shoulders sagged with relief as his son finally got the nourishment he desperately needed. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion etched there. 3 days of hard riding through winter storms would wear down any man. But Elias suspected King's journey had started long before that. Snow pelted against the window panes as the storm intensified outside. The goat remained calm, seemingly content to nurse the hungry infant, while Elias moved quietly around the cabin, gathering extra blankets and putting coffee on to boil. He tried not to stare at the striking figure King cut, proud even in his obvious fatigue, with a tenderness in how he cradled his son that spoke volumes about his character. "The fever should break soon with rest and warm milk," Elias offered quietly, setting a steaming cup near King's knee. "You're welcome to wait out the storm here." It was more words than he usually spoke to anyone these days, but something about this man's desperate quest to save his child had broken through Elias's carefully maintained walls. King's dark eyes met his, filled with gratitude and something deeper, recognition perhaps, of a shared pain. "King Hawk," he introduced himself simply, "and this is Joseph." "Elias Moore," he responded with a slight nod. "Get some rest, King. You're safe here." The fire crackled steadily as night descended outside, and little Joseph's breathing gradually eased as he continued to nurse. King remained vigilant despite his obvious exhaustion, one large hand gently stroking his son's dark hair. Elias settled into his worn chair nearby, keeping watch over them both as the storm raged on. The lantern cast a warm glow across the cabin's weathered walls as Elias hung King's sodden coat near the stove to dry. Steam rose from the heavy fabric, carrying the scent of horse, sweat, and winter storms. Little Hawk had finally fallen into an easier sleep, cradled in his father's massive arms while the goat settled contentedly in the corner, chewing her cud. Elias poured thick black coffee into 2 tin cups, offering one to King. The man's large hands wrapped around the warm metal, but his dark eyes remained fixed on his son's face, watching each tiny breath as if afraid it might stop. "San Carlos Reservation," King said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "That's where we started from. Sarah, my wife, she—" His voice caught, thick with grief. The birth was too hard. No doctor would come for an Indian woman, even with my military service. Bitterness edged his words. She held him once, named him Little Hawk, then slipped away while the snow was starting to fall. Elias sat heavily in his chair, his own memories of loss weighing on him. "I'm sorry," he offered simply, knowing no words could truly ease that kind of pain. King nodded, taking a long drink of coffee before continuing. "Winter came early this year. Game was scarce, government rations even scarcer. Little Hawk needed milk, and there was none to be had. So we rode north, trying to reach the winter camps where my father's people gather. But the storms—" He glanced at the window, where wind still howled like a hungry wolf. The goat bleated softly from her corner, and Elias rose to check on her. He'd arranged clean straw and blankets to keep her comfortable, positioning her near enough to the stove's warmth that her milk wouldn't chill through the night. The kitchen corner would serve well enough as a temporary barn. "Any kin who might help?" Elias asked, though he suspected the answer from the weary resignation in King's bearing. "None living," King confirmed, shifting Little Hawk gently as the baby stirred. "My mother's people want nothing to do with a half-breed scout who served the army. My father's band is scattered since the treaties broke. We're alone." The admission hung heavy in the lamplight. Elias recognized the weight of solitude in King's voice. He'd carried it himself since losing his family. Outside, the storm's fury increased, rattling the window panes and sending drafts dancing across the floorboards. "Best get some rest," Elias said gruffly, gathering extra blankets from his trunk. "Storm's not letting up tonight." King accepted the bedding with quiet thanks, making a careful nest near the stove where Little Hawk could stay warm. Despite his obvious exhaustion, the big man's eyes remained alert, scanning the cabin's shadows with the soldier's wariness before finally allowing himself to relax beside his sleeping son. Elias banked the fire for the night and climbed into his own narrow bed, listening to the storm's violence gradually ease into his dreams. Gray dawn light filtered through frosted windows when Elias woke. His first glance was toward his guests. King slept deeply. One protective arm curled around Little Hawk. The baby's face had lost its frightening flush, replaced by healthy color. His breathing came easy and clear in the morning quiet. Moving carefully to avoid waking them, Elias rebuilt the fire and mixed cornmeal for Johnny cakes. The familiar motions of cooking felt different somehow with others to feed. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shared his table with anyone. The smell of food roused King, who checked his son anxiously, before allowing himself to relax at the sight of Little Hawk's improvement. "The fever's broken," he said softly, relief evident in his deep voice. "Good eating will help him stay strong," Elias replied, sliding golden Johnny cakes onto tin plates. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by Little Hawk's occasional happy gurgles as he nursed from the patient goat. After breakfast, Elias pulled on his heavy coat. "Barn roof needs clearing before the snow gets too heavy. Extra hands would be welcome if you're willing." King nodded, wrapping Little Hawk securely in fresh blankets and settling him in a makeshift cradle near the stove, where they could hear him cry if he needed anything. Outside, the storm had calmed to light flurries, revealing a world transformed into rolling white drifts. They worked steadily, shoveling snow from the barn's pitched roof to protect it from collapse. Though they spoke little, Elias found himself appreciating King's efficient help and careful attention to detail, the marks of both his military training and his native upbringing. There was an ease to their shared labor that spoke of growing trust, like a fragile seedling pushing through winter soil. By mid-morning, the clouds began to break, allowing weak sunlight to sparkle across the pristine snow. Elias paused in his work, studying the transformed landscape as he caught his breath. "When the weather clears proper," he said thoughtfully, "I can help you get to Silverton for supplies. Know some folks there who won't ask too many questions. Might even know a safe route to where your people winter camp." King straightened, studying Elias's face with careful consideration. After a moment, he offered a slight nod of acceptance. It wasn't quite friendship yet, but understanding had begun to grow between them. Two solitary men finding unexpected common ground in the wake of a desperate night. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the quiet. Elias looked up from mending a bridle near the barn door, his stomach tightening at the sight of Deputy Clem Norris's distinctive gray gelding picking its way through the drifts. The deputy's spurs jingled as he dismounted, his badge catching the weak winter light. Snow crunched under his boots as he stamped them against the porch steps, shaking off the cold. His pleasant expression didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, Moore," Norris called out, his voice carrying that false warmth that made Elias's skin crawl. "Need to have a word with you." Elias set down his work carefully, moving to block the barn doorway. "Deputy," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "What brings you up this way in such weather?" Norris pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got a warrant here, looking for a half-breed by the name of Samuel Hawk, goes by King, accused of rustling cattle from the Thompson spread." He paused meaningfully. Railroad's mighty interested in seeing him brought in. Ice that had nothing to do with the temperature crept down Elias's spine. Thompson was known to be deep in the railroad's pocket, his ranch strategically placed along their planned expansion route. The accusation's timing was too convenient to be coincidence. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Elias said evenly, meeting the deputy's gaze. "Storms kept most travelers down in the valley." "Mind if I have a look around?" Norris's hand rested casually near his holster. "Just doing my duty, you understand." Elias gestured toward the barn with deliberate calm. "Feel free, though I'd appreciate if you'd mind the goat. She's nursing and easily spooked." The deputy ducked inside, boots scraping on the wooden floor as he peered into the shadows. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, knowing King and Little Hawk were safely hidden in the cabin's root cellar, but fear still coiled in his gut. A shout from the trail interrupted Norris's search. One of his deputies appeared through the swirling snow, waving urgently. "Got trouble back in town, sir!" Jenkins started another fight at the saloon. Norris cursed under his breath, emerging from the barn. "This isn't finished, Moore," he said, voice hard despite his smile. "I'll be back to continue our discussion." "Looking forward to it," Elias replied dryly, watching as the two lawmen mounted up and rode away, their forms gradually swallowed by the gathering dusk. Only when the sound of hooves had completely faded did Elias hurry to the cabin. He rapped twice on the floor, their agreed signal, before lifting the heavy trapdoor. King emerged like a shadow, Little Hawk bundled securely against his chest. "He's gone for now," Elias said, helping them up. "But he'll be back?" King's expression was grim as he settled by the fire, checking that the baby hadn't taken a chill from their time below. "Thompson's spread," he said quietly. "Should have known they'd try something like this." Elias stirred the stew he'd left simmering, ladling generous portions into bowls. They needed the warmth after the cellar's damp chill. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" King accepted the food with a grateful nod, waiting until they were both seated before speaking. "The winter camp where my father's people gather. It's on land the railroad wants for their new spur line. Good water access, natural path through the mountains." His spoon scraped the bowl thoughtfully. "They've been trying to push us out for months, claiming we have no legal right to be there, even though it's been our wintering ground for generations." "And now they're trying to frame you for theft," Elias concluded. "Get you arrested, clear the way for taking the land while your people are vulnerable." "A man in jail can't defend his territory," King agreed heavily. "Or his son." His arms tightened protectively around Little Hawk, who slept peacefully, oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Elias stared into his stew, understanding the weight of his choice with brutal clarity. By sheltering King, he was making himself an enemy of the railroad. They wouldn't hesitate to destroy him to get what they wanted. He'd seen it happen to other independent ranchers who stood in their way. The fire crackled in the gathering darkness, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Little Hawk stirred and whimpered, and King hummed a soft melody that might have been a lullaby in his father's tongue. The simple domesticity of the moment stood in sharp contrast to the danger building around them. They spent the rest of the evening in watchful silence, each man lost in his thoughts. Elias fashioned a makeshift cradle from a wooden supply box, lining it with his softest blankets and positioning it near enough to the fire to keep the baby warm through the night. King checked and rechecked the window latches, his military training evident in the way he assessed sightlines and potential approaches to the cabin. The snow began falling again as night deepened, and with it came the certainty that tomorrow would bring harder choices. But watching King tend to his son with such gentle care, Elias knew he couldn't have acted differently. Some things were worth the risk, even if it meant putting everything he had worked for on the line. That night, after the deputy's unsettling visit, Elias gathered an armful of quilts from the cabin's storage chest. The wool blankets still held the faint scent of cedar, a reminder of warmer days when he'd packed them away. He carried them to the barn, where King was already examining the hayloft's sturdy planks. "It's not much," Elias said, climbing the ladder with his burden, "but it's warm enough once you get settled. The hay helps keep the heat in." King accepted the quilts with a grateful nod. "Better than where I've been sleeping lately?" He arranged the bedding with military precision, creating a nest-like space where the hay met the barn wall. The location offered a clear view of both the barn door and the small window above. Dawn brought bitter clarity about King's horse. The animal lay frozen where it had fallen, its dark coat dusted with fresh snow. King stood over his faithful mount for a long moment, head bowed in silent tribute. Together, they salvaged what they could, the well-worn saddle with its intricate tooling, the supple leather bridle that spoke of careful maintenance. Elias helped King store the tack in the barn's tack room, promising to oil the leather later to prevent it from cracking in the dry winter air. The next 2 days settled into an unexpected rhythm, as natural as breathing. Each morning, Elias rose early to milk the goat, the warm streams hitting the pail with a familiar ping. King took to the wood chopping with vigor, his powerful swings making short work of the seasoned logs. They shared the task of caring for Little Hawk, passing the infant between them as needs arose. The baby thrived under their joint attention. His fever had broken completely, replaced by bright eyes and grasping hands that seemed determined to catch hold of anything within reach. Elias found himself smiling more often, remembering the brief joy of his own fatherhood while watching King cradle his son. When Elias discovered a broken rail in the corral, he took the opportunity to share his knowledge. "See here," he demonstrated, showing King how to notch the new piece of wood. "It needs to fit snug, or the whole section will work loose come spring thaw." King proved an apt student, his hands quick to learn the carpenter's skills. In return, he took Elias's dull axe and showed him how to sharpen it properly, using smooth practice strokes with a whetstone. "My father taught me this," he explained quietly. "Said a sharp tool shows respect for the work." They moved carefully through their days, mindful of making too much noise. Every approaching hoofbeat brought tension, though so far it had only been deer moving through the snow-laden trees. The deputy's threat hung over them like storm clouds, making them appreciate the peaceful moments all the more. On the third day, as they sat checking Little Hawk's swaddling clothes for wear, King finally shared his story. His voice was low but clear, weighted with generations of history. "My father's people have wintered in those valleys since before anyone can remember," he began, fingers gentle as he rewrapped his son. "When the first treaties came, they promised we could keep our seasonal camps, said it was all written down in Washington." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Paper promises don't mean much when railroad men start waving money around." Elias nodded, thinking of the Ute family who used to trade with his parents when he was young. They'd vanished one season, their traditional hunting grounds suddenly claimed by a cattle company. He'd never forgotten his father's quiet anger at the injustice. "Government agents came last spring," King continued. "Told us we were trespassing on public land, he repeated softly, as if the elk and the rivers care about property deeds. The afternoon light was fading when King reached into his salvaged saddlebag and withdrew a small wooden flute. It was simply carved but beautiful, dark wood polished by years of handling. As the first notes filled the cabin, Elias recognized it as more than just music. It was a bridge between worlds, between generations. The lullaby King played was gentle as falling snow, rising and falling like wind through mountain passes. Little Hawk's eyes grew heavy as he listened, tiny fingers relaxing their grip on his blanket. Even the goat seemed soothed, settling into her corner with a contented sigh. Outside, the weather was beginning to turn. The noonday sun had enough strength to start melting the snow, sending occasional drops of water pattering from the cabin's eaves. The sound provided a soft counterpoint to King's music, nature herself joining the melody. Elias watched father and son in the firelight, seeing how the music bound them together, carrying echoes of all the lullabies that had come before. It spoke of a heritage that no piece of paper could truly capture or take away. In that moment, he understood with complete clarity why King had risked this desperate winter journey, not just for survival, but for his son's birthright. The last notes faded into the cabin's shadows. Little Hawk was fully asleep now, his peaceful breathing a reminder of how much had changed in just a few days. They had started as strangers thrown together by circumstance. But something else was growing in the quiet moments between responsibilities, in the shared work and unspoken understanding. The afternoon sun had worked its magic on the snow, creating patches of slush between the remaining drifts. Elias hitched his team to the wagon, checking each horse's harness with practiced care. The wooden water barrels rattled empty in the bed as he secured them with rope. King emerged from the barn with Little Hawk wrapped snugly against his chest, multiple blankets protecting the infant from the lingering cold. "Room for 2 more?" he asked, already moving toward the wagon. "Plenty of space," Elias replied, offering a hand to help King climb into the wagon bed. He watched as the tall man settled himself between the barrels, making sure Little Hawk was protected from the wind. The wagon wheels creaked as they set out, following the old track that led to the creek. Around them, the winter landscape stretched white and silent, broken only by bare-branched aspens and the dark green of pine trees. Here and there, deer tracks crossed their path, delicate impressions in the snow telling stories of early morning foraging. Looks like they're staying close to the meadow edges, King observed, nodding toward a cluster of tracks. Smart, better shelter there, and the browsing's good. Elias guided the team carefully around a drift. Been seeing more of them this winter than usual. Might mean a harder season up in the high country. They passed the frozen meadow where Elias usually cut his summer hay. Now it lay pristine under its white blanket, the fence posts marking its boundaries like silent sentinels. Little Hawk made a soft sound, and King adjusted the blankets, humming that same gentle tune from the night before. The creek came into view, its waters running dark between ice-crusted banks. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop near their usual watering spot, but before he could climb down, King was already moving. "Wait," King said, passing Little Hawk carefully to Elias. "Let me check the ice first." He moved along the bank with the sure-footed grace of someone who had read water all his life. Kneeling, he used a stick to test the ice's thickness at different points. "See here," he called, gesturing for Elias to join him. "The ice is thickest where the water runs slowest. But over there," he pointed to a darker patch, "that's where the trout gather. The current keeps the water from freezing solid. Good place to fish, if you know how to break through careful." Elias absorbed the lesson, noting how King read the creek like a book written in ice and water. Together, they found the safest spot to fill the barrels, working in comfortable silence, broken only by the splash of water and the occasional snuffle from Little Hawk. The sun was past its peak when they turned toward home, the filled barrels sloshing gently with each bump in the track. King had resumed his place in the wagon bed, this time pointing out different animal signs they passed: rabbit runs, the wing marks where an owl had struck the snow, the deep punch holes of elk moving through the drifts. Their easy mood shattered the moment they approached the cabin. Elias spotted it first, a piece of paper stuck firmly under the door, fluttering in the breeze like a wounded bird. His hands tightened on the reins as he brought the wagon to a stop. King was already moving, passing Little Hawk back to Elias as he jumped down to retrieve the note. His face darkened as he read, then wordlessly handed it to Elias. The deputy's handwriting was precise and threatening. "Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense. Don't make me bring charges against a respected rancher. Turn him out or face the consequences." "Deputy Norris!" Elias crumpled the paper in his fist, feeling the rage build in his chest. King was already pulling his few belongings together when Elias entered the cabin. "I cannot bring this trouble to your door," King said, his voice tight with resignation. "You have shown us more kindness than I had any right to expect, but I won't see you lose everything because of me." "Stop," Elias said firmly, still holding Little Hawk. As if on cue, the baby let out a small, wet cough that seemed to echo in the cabin's silence. "Listen to that. You take him out there tonight, and it won't be the law that kills him, it'll be the cold." King's shoulders tensed, his internal struggle visible in every line of his body. "The deputy won't stop. He's got railroad money behind him, and they want my father's land clear before spring." "Then they'll have to come through me to get it," Elias replied, his quiet voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He moved to the fireplace, adding another log to build up the warmth. "I've lived by the law my whole life, King, but there's law and there's right. Sometimes they're not the same thing." The baby coughed again, and both men instinctively moved closer to check on him. His cheeks were pink, but not with fever, just the healthy flush of a well-fed infant fighting off the remains of his illness. As darkness settled outside, Elias made 2 trips to check the fire, ensuring it would burn strong through the night. Each time, he noted King watching him with a mixture of gratitude and concern that made his chest tight with emotion. Before heading to his bed, Elias took his rifle from its usual place and moved it closer to the door. The motion was deliberate, unhurried, a statement as much as a precaution. He checked the action and loaded it with the same care he gave all his tools. King observed this from where he sat with his sleeping son. "You're sure about this?" he asked one final time. Elias met his eyes in the firelight. "I am," he said simply, and in those 2 words was a promise that went beyond the rifle by the door or the warmth of the fire. It was a promise that said, "Here is safety, here is shelter, here you can rest." The baby slept on, unaware of the weight of the moment passing between the two men. Outside, the night settled cold and clear around the cabin, while inside, the fire crackled steadily, casting its protective glow over all three of its inhabitants. Morning light spilled across the frost-covered ground, turning every crystal into a tiny diamond. Despite the bright sun, the air remained sharp with cold, biting at exposed skin and forcing breath out in visible puffs. Inside the barn, Elias spread out the broken harness on his workbench, the leather stiff and cracked from years of use. King stood beside him, Little Hawk secured warmly against his chest in a sling made from one of Elias's old blankets. "See here!" Elias pointed to where the stitching had given way. "Leatherwork's not so different from other mending. Main thing is having the right tools and taking your time." He laid out his kit, heavy needles, wax thread, and an awl for punching new holes. King watched intently as Elias demonstrated how to work the thick needle through the tough material. "Like this?" he asked, taking the tools and mimicking the motion. "That's right," Elias nodded, pleased with King's natural aptitude. "Keep the stitches even, and make sure they're tight enough to hold, but not so tight they tear through." They worked side by side, the quiet punctuated by Little Hawk's occasional coos and the scratch of needle through leather. King's large hands, so skilled with weapons and horses, proved equally deft at the delicate work of repair. "My father used to say a man who can't fix his own gear has no business using it," King remarked, finishing a particularly neat section of stitching. "Wise man," Elias replied, checking King's work with approval. "Out here, you either learn to mend or you go without." The morning passed quickly as they completed the harness repair. After a simple lunch of cornbread and beans, they headed out to gather wood. The sound of their axes rang through the crisp air as they cut through fallen deadwood, the work warming them despite the cold. King proved to be an efficient partner, moving with the rhythm of someone used to physical labor. They developed a smooth system, one cutting while the other stacked, that had them finishing the task faster than Elias usually managed alone. It was during the afternoon milking that Elias noticed the problem. The goat, usually reliable, gave barely half her normal yield. He frowned, recognizing the signs he'd been dreading. "She's starting to dry up," he explained to King, who stood watching with concern. "It happens this time of year, especially with older nannies." King's arms tightened protectively around Little Hawk. "How long?" "Maybe a week at this rate." Elias sat back on his stool, mind working through options. "There's a woman in town, sells milk goats, but going into town now would draw attention," King finished, understanding the risk. Elias nodded, then remembered Thomas, a neighbor whose boy sometimes brought eggs to trade. The lad was young but trustworthy, and his family kept goats. Moving to his small desk, Elias pulled out paper and pencil, composing a careful note. "Need another milking nanny. Fair price offered. Discretion appreciated. EM double quote." The boy arrived with eggs just before sunset. As he sometimes did, Elias handed him the note along with an extra coin, saying only, "For your father's eyes." Inside, the cabin had grown cozy with the heat from the cook stove. Elias stirred a pot of rich stew he'd been saving, venison with dried vegetables and barley, the kind of hearty meal that helped ward off winter's chill. King sat at the table, attempting to feed Little Hawk his first taste of mashed beans. The baby's face screwed up in confusion at the new texture, making both men laugh softly. "Here," Elias demonstrated, mixing the beans with a little broth to make them smoother. "Try it now." Little Hawk seemed more accepting of this version, though more ended up on his chin than in his mouth. King cleaned his son's face with gentle patience, his expression soft in the lamplight. "He's growing stronger," Elias observed, serving up bowls of stew. "You can see it in his eyes." King nodded, settling the baby more comfortably in his lap. "Thanks to you and your goat." He paused, stirring his stew thoughtfully. "I never expected, when I rode up that night." "No need," Elias cut him off gently, understanding what was left unsaid. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds being the clink of spoons and the periodic crack of frost forming on the window pane. After the meal, Elias took Little Hawk while King cleaned up, an arrangement that had become natural over their days together. The baby snuggled into Elias's arms, eyes growing heavy as the warmth and full belly worked their magic. Elias rocked slightly, humming an old hymn his mother used to sing. He felt King's eyes on him, but kept his attention on the drowsy infant, pretending not to notice the intense gaze or the emotions it might reveal. Little Hawk drifted off to sleep, one tiny hand clutching Elias's shirt. In the quiet moment, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows and the fire casting its gentle glow, Elias allowed himself to acknowledge how right this felt: the weight of a sleeping child in his arms, the presence of another person sharing his space, the sense of purpose in protecting them both. He looked up to find King still watching, something unspoken but profound in his dark eyes. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibilities neither man was ready to name. 2 days after sending the note, the crunch of hooves on frozen ground announced a visitor. Elias stepped out to find Thomas's hired hand, Jim, leading a young nanny goat by a rope. The animal was cream-colored with dark patches, healthy and well-fed. "Thomas said you could use another milker," Jim said casually, keeping his voice low. "This one's extra from the spring kidding. Good producer." Elias nodded, understanding the discretion. Mighty kind of him. He slipped several coins into Jim's coat pocket while pretending to brush snow from the man's sleeve. "Tell Thomas I'm obliged." Jim tipped his hat and departed without another word, leaving Elias to lead the new goat to the barn. King emerged from the shadows as Elias settled her into a clean stall. "Your neighbor asks no questions?" King inquired, Little Hawk secure in his arms. "Thomas minds his own business," Elias replied, checking the goat's udder. "And he's no friend to the railroad men." He straightened up, satisfied. "She'll do fine. Should be giving milk through the winter." The goat adapted quickly to her new home, accepting a handful of hay from both men. By evening, she was producing sweet, rich milk that made Little Hawk smack his lips in contentment. The next morning, King noticed the barn door hanging crooked on its track. "This needs fixing before the next storm," he observed, running his hand along the warped wood. "The weight's pulling it off center." Elias had been meaning to repair it for months, but hadn't found the time. "There's tools in the tack room," he offered, and some spare lumber behind the feed bin. King set to work with methodical precision, measuring twice before making any cuts. His military training showed in how he organized the tools, laying everything out in neat rows. Elias watched him work while mending torn blankets, his needle weaving steady patterns through worn cloth. The quiet industry of their morning was interrupted by the distant jingle of harness bells. Elias peered out the window to see Reverend Matthews's wagon approaching. The circuit preacher made his rounds every few weeks, bringing news and spiritual comfort to isolated homesteads. "Best stay out of sight," Elias murmured to King, who was already moving toward the hayloft ladder. Little Hawk was sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle, out of view from the door. Reverend Matthews was a lean man with kind eyes and weather-beaten skin. He carried a box of canned goods, his usual offering to the remote households he visited. "Brother Moore," he greeted warmly, "I've brought some preserves and a message of hope this fine Sunday." Elias helped unload the provisions while the preacher spoke of mercy and God's mysterious ways of bringing people together. His sermon touched on unlikely families formed through adversity, citing biblical examples of strangers becoming kin through acts of compassion. From his hidden perch in the hayloft, King listened intently. The preacher's words about mercy and sanctuary carried special weight in their current situation. Elias stood by the wagon, engaging enough to be polite, but careful not to invite the Reverend inside. "The Lord works in unexpected ways," Reverend Matthews concluded, preparing to leave. "Sometimes the greatest blessings come through helping those in need." Elias nodded, thinking of the small family sheltering in his barn. "Truth in that, Reverend." After the wagon disappeared down the snowy track, King descended from the hayloft. Little Hawk was awake now, making soft noises as he played with a clean rag. The men settled in for their evening routine, sharing coffee by the warmth of the stove. Outside, early stars pricked through the darkening sky. "Been a while since I heard preaching," King admitted, watching steam rise from his cup. "Not since we buried my father," the reservation pastor spoke over him, half Apache prayers, half Christian words. Seemed fitting somehow. Elias listened quietly, giving King space to continue. "Father believed in both ways," King went on. "Said truth was truth no matter the language it was spoken in." He glanced at Elias. "I respect your faith, seen how it guides your actions, not just your words." "The good book's pretty clear about helping those in need," Elias replied simply. "Don't take much interpretation." Little Hawk chose that moment to drop his cloth, letting out a demanding squawk. King retrieved it, smiling as his son immediately began gumming the fabric with fierce concentration. "Getting stronger every day," Elias observed, watching the baby's determined expression. "Yes," King agreed softly. "Thanks to mercy and unlikely family." They sat together in companionable silence, sipping their coffee while Little Hawk entertained himself with his cloth. The fire crackled low in the stove, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called to the rising moon. In that peaceful moment, Elias felt the truth of the preacher's words about unexpected blessings. His quiet life had been transformed by the arrival of these two souls seeking shelter. Though danger still lurked outside their door, here in the warm circle of lamplight, he felt the rightness of his choice to offer sanctuary. Late February brought a shift in the weather. The heavy snow gave way to a relentless, icy rain that drummed against the cabin's roof day and night. The change made work more challenging, but it didn't stop Elias and King from tackling necessary repairs around the property. They worked together on the fence lines, moving methodically along the perimeter. Little Hawk stayed warm and dry in a makeshift sling against Elias's chest, fashioned from a sturdy piece of canvas. The baby seemed content there, lulled by the steady motion as Elias worked, occasionally reaching out to pat the rough fabric with tiny fingers. "Post is rotting here," King called out one afternoon, testing a wooden fence post with experienced hands. "Won't last another season." Elias nodded, already reaching for the tools they'd brought along. "Got some cedar posts in the wagon, better than pine, lasts longer in the wet." They fell into an efficient rhythm, King digging out the old posts while Elias held the baby and prepared the replacements. The work was easier with two pairs of hands, and they covered more ground than Elias ever managed alone. During one of their breaks, sheltering under a makeshift tarp from the drizzle, Thomas's boy rode up with eggs and news from town. The boy's expression was worried as he delivered his message. "Deputy Norris been asking lots of questions about you, Mr. Moore," he said, glancing nervously at King, who had stepped back into the shadows. "Coming by the store every few days, wanting to know if anyone's seen strange tracks or extra smoke from your chimney." Elias kept his face neutral as he paid for the eggs. "Appreciate the word. You ride safe now." After the boy left, King spoke quietly. "We're putting you at risk staying here." Elias was silent for a moment, watching the rain create patterns in the mud. Then he turned to King with determination in his eyes. "Been thinking. Your people's winter camp, they could use these cattle, couldn't they?" King's expression shifted from surprise to careful consideration. "The hunting's been poor this season. A herd like this could feed the camp for months." "Then that's what we'll do," Elias said firmly. "Drive them to your people before the railroad men can cause more trouble. Better than leaving them here for Norris to seize." They spent that evening planning, Little Hawk sleeping peacefully in his box beside the fire. King drew rough maps on scraps of paper, marking out routes that avoided the main roads and railroad stations. Elias listed supplies they'd need: food, ammunition, extra horseshoes, medical supplies for both humans and cattle. "We'll need to move careful," King said, tracing a line across the crude map. "There's a pass here that's treacherous in the wet, but it's the best way to avoid being seen." Each night after that, they refined their plans. While rain pattered against the windows, they sharpened tools, checked tack, and prepared for the drive. Elias taught King which cattle were strongest and which might need extra attention on the trail. King shared his knowledge of hidden water sources and safe places to make camp. Little Hawk grew stronger daily, his personality emerging more with each passing week. He'd recently discovered the joy of gripping things, particularly favoring King's fingers. One evening, as King sat cleaning his rifle, the baby latched onto his index finger and refused to let go. "Strong grip," King murmured, pride evident in his voice. "Like his mother." It was the first time he'd mentioned her without pain shadowing his features. Elias looked up from where he was repairing a saddle strap. "He's thriving now. Got that spark in his eyes." The rain intensified that night, drumming hard against the roof. The sound reminded Elias of that first desperate night when King had appeared at his door with a dying horse and a failing baby. The memory made him check the fire, adding another log to keep the cabin warm. King watched him, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Elias," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the rain, "I need to thank you. What you did, giving my son a chance to live." He paused, struggling with the weight of his words. "There's no way to repay that kind of debt." "No debt between friends," Elias replied simply, settling back in his chair. "Or family." The word hung in the air between them, filled with meaning. They'd moved beyond mere shelter and sanctuary into something deeper, a bond forged through shared purpose and trust. Little Hawk made a small sound in his sleep, and both men turned to look at him. The baby's face was peaceful, his tiny hand still curled around his father's finger, even in sleep. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, but inside the cabin, warmth and hope prevailed as they continued planning their bold move to save both the herd and King's people from the coming spring. The preparations for their departure consumed them over the next few days. Elias and King worked methodically, gathering supplies and checking equipment with practiced efficiency. In the cabin's warmth, they laid out their provisions on the worn wooden table. Burlap sacks of dried beans, heavy bags of flour, and carefully wrapped packages of ammunition for their rifles. King fashioned an ingenious sling for Little Hawk, using soft leather and strong canvas. He tested it repeatedly, making sure it would hold the baby securely against his chest while riding. "Need to keep him warm and protected," King explained, adjusting the straps. "Trail's going to be rough." Elias watched as King demonstrated how the sling would work, noting how the baby seemed content in the makeshift carrier. Little Hawk had grown significantly stronger during his time at the cabin, his cheeks now full and rosy where they had once been pale and sunken. The evening before their planned departure, Elias sat by the fire, going through his mental checklist one final time. The cattle were gathered in the nearest pasture, ready for the drive. Their provisions were packed, the wagon loaded with everything they would need for the journey. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating, with the sky clearing and the temperature holding steady. But as darkness settled over the land, something caught Elias's attention. A flicker of movement near the barn, visible through the cabin's frost-rimmed window. At first he thought it might be deer, which sometimes ventured close to the buildings during harsh weather. But these shadows moved with purpose, distinctly human in their movements. Elias crossed the room silently and gently shook King awake. "Someone's out there," he whispered, gesturing toward the window. King rose without a sound, years of military training evident in his fluid movement. They both peered through the glass, their breath fogging the pane. In the pale moonlight, they could make out two figures on horseback, moving with deliberate stealth around the edge of the property. "Heading toward town," King murmured, his voice tight with concern as they watched the riders disappear down the trail. Neither man slept much after that. They took turns keeping watch, with Little Hawk sleeping peacefully, unaware of the tension in the cabin. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon, they began loading the final items into the wagon, hoping to get an early start before whatever trouble those night riders might bring could catch up to them. But they weren't fast enough. The sound of multiple horses approaching came just as Elias was securing the last rope on the wagon. Deputy Clem Norris rode at the head of a group of 6 men, their horses' hooves crunching in the crusty snow. Behind them came a 7th rider in a fine coat, a man Elias recognized as the railroad's lawyer. Norris dismounted with a deliberate slowness, his spurs jingling in the morning quiet. "Moore," he called out, his voice carrying false pleasantness. "Seems we need to have us a conversation." King stood very still near the barn, his hand instinctively moving to where Little Hawk was bundled against his chest. Elias stepped forward, positioning himself between the posse and his friend. "What brings you out so early, Deputy?" Elias asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. Norris pulled 2 papers from his coat. "Got here 2 items of interest," he said, unfolding them with exaggerated care. "First, a warrant for the arrest of Samuel King Hawk, wanted for cattle theft and other sundry crimes." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "Second, something Mr. Briggs here, representing the railroad, would like to discuss with you." The lawyer stepped forward, his expensive boots unsuited for the muddy yard. "Mr. Moore, I regret to inform you that this property is now subject to forfeiture due to unpaid taxes. We have the legal documentation here." "That's impossible," Elias protested, his voice rising. "I've paid every tax bill that's come my way." "Nevertheless," the lawyer said smoothly, "the papers are in order. You can examine them yourself." 2 of Norris's men had already moved to flank King, who stood rigid, his eyes meeting Elias's with a mix of resignation and apology. Little Hawk, sensing the tension, began to fuss. "Come on now, King," Norris called out. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Those irons can go on easy or hard, your choice." For a moment, King looked like he might fight. His shoulders tensed, and Elias could see him calculating the odds. But then Little Hawk let out a frightened cry, and the fight drained from King's posture. "Elias," King said softly, "take him." With gentle movements that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the moment, King unwrapped Little Hawk from the sling and passed him to Elias. The baby immediately began crying harder, his small hands reaching back toward his father. The deputies moved in with the iron shackles, and King offered no resistance as they bound his wrists. He kept his dignity even as they led him to a waiting horse, his back straight and his head high. Elias stood helplessly in the trampled snow, trying to comfort the increasingly distraught Little Hawk. The baby's cries grew more intense until he began to choke on his own tears, his face turning red with distress. Through tear-filled eyes, Elias watched the posse lead King away. The line of horses grew smaller and smaller, disappearing down the snow-covered trail until there was nothing left to see but the empty path and the marks their horses had left in the snow. Little Hawk continued to sob against his chest, the child's grief echoing Elias's own feelings of helplessness and rage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, and the warm promise of their carefully laid plans lay scattered like the trampled snow beneath his feet. The lawyer remained behind, still holding out the papers. "You'll want to review these, Mr. Moore. We can discuss terms for your departure from the property." But Elias barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the trail where King had disappeared, and on the crying child in his arms who had just lost his father for the second time in his short life. The night settled heavy and cold over the cabin, but inside, rest was impossible. Elias paced back and forth across the worn floorboards, trying to soothe Little Hawk's inconsolable crying. The baby had been wailing since King's arrest, refusing the goat's milk and working himself into such a state that his tiny face had turned red with effort. "Shh, little one," Elias murmured, bouncing the child gently against his shoulder. I know you want your pa." The fire in the hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Every time Elias passed near it, he caught glimpses of the empty chair where King had sat just yesterday, playing his wooden flute for his son. The memory made his chest tight with anger and worry. As he walked, his mind churned with possibilities. The railroad's claim about unpaid taxes gnawed at him. He knew he had paid every bill, had always been careful about such things. Something wasn't right about this whole situation. Near midnight, with Little Hawk finally hiccuping himself into an exhausted doze, Elias remembered his old lockbox. He laid the baby carefully in his makeshift cradle and pulled the metal box from beneath his bed. The key was where it had always been, on a leather cord around his neck. Inside, he found exactly what he was looking for: neat stacks of receipts for every tax payment he had made since acquiring the ranch. Each one was dated and signed by the county treasurer. But as he rifled through the papers, his fingers touched something else, a letter he had almost forgotten about. Unfolding the yellowed paper carefully, Elias read the words by firelight. It was from Captain James Morrison, retired from the United States Army, dated 3 years prior. The letter spoke highly of King's service as a scout, praising his dedication, loyalty, and exceptional skills. More importantly, it specifically mentioned King's help in preventing cattle theft along the reservation borders. Elias sat back on his heels, the papers spread before him. Here was proof of his rightful ownership, proof of King's character. These weren't the papers of a tax dodger and a cattle thief. These were documents that told a very different story. The baby stirred, whimpering in his sleep. Elias looked from the papers to Little Hawk and back again. A plan began forming in his mind. When dawn broke, pale and cold across the snow-covered yard, Elias had already packed what they needed. He wrapped Little Hawk securely against his chest, using King's carefully made sling. The baby, though still fussy, seemed calmer, pressed close to Elias's warmth. The lockbox and its crucial papers went into his saddlebags, along with enough supplies for several days' journey. The county seat was a good distance away, but that's where they needed to go, to the judge who could look at these papers and see the truth. His horse stamped impatiently in the early morning chill as Elias mounted carefully, making sure Little Hawk was settled comfortably. The journey would be slow. Recent thaws had turned the trails to slush and mud, making travel treacherous. They set out as the sun cleared the mountain peaks. Elias kept to a steady pace, mindful of both his precious cargo and the treacherous footing. Every few hours, he stopped to check on Little Hawk, feeding him goat's milk from a bottle he'd prepared and changing the cloth diapers as needed. The day wore on, the horse's hooves making sucking sounds in the mud. Little Hawk dozed on and off, surprisingly content with the gentle motion of the horse. Elias found himself talking softly to the baby, pointing out birds and describing the mountains around them, anything to keep the child's spirits up. As dusk approached, Elias knew they needed to make camp. He found a relatively dry spot beneath some pine trees and strung up a canvas sheet for shelter. The ground was cold and damp, but he laid out his bedroll and tucked Little Hawk close against him for warmth. "Your pa's got strength in him," Elias whispered to the drowsy baby as they settled in for the night. "And we're going to help him show everyone the truth." The night was long and cold. Every time Little Hawk stirred, Elias woke instantly, checking to make sure the baby was warm enough. By morning, frost had formed along the edges of their blanket, making it crackle when they moved. Elias broke camp at first light, his joints stiff from the cold ground. As he mounted up again, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in a long while, praying out loud. "Lord," he murmured, adjusting Little Hawk's blankets, "I know you've got your reasons for everything, but we sure could use some favor here. That baby needs his father, and that man needs justice." They pushed on through the morning, each mile bringing them closer to the county seat and, Elias hoped, to setting things right. The papers in his saddlebag felt like they carried the weight of 3 lives: his own, King's, and most importantly, the child sleeping trustingly against his chest. With every hoofbeat, every mile covered in the cold mountain air, Elias's determination grew stronger. He had proof of both his ownership and King's character. Now he just had to make sure the right people saw it. The baby stirred against him, making small snuffling noises. Elias patted his back gently through the sling. "Don't you worry, little one," he said softly. "We're going to bring your pa home." After 2 grueling days on muddy mountain trails, Elias finally rode into the county seat of Silver Creek. The small town bustled with activity despite the late winter chill. Its main street a mess of churned earth and melting snow. Wagons creaked past, their wheels throwing up brown splatter, while townspeople hurried along the wooden sidewalks in thick coats and boots. Little Hawk, who had been remarkably patient throughout their journey, began fussing as they passed the general store. Elias knew he needed someone to watch the baby while he dealt with the legal matters. He'd heard good things about Mrs. Peterson's boarding house from travelers who stopped at his ranch, and it didn't take long to spot the neat two-story building with its fresh white paint and green shutters. Mrs. Peterson herself answered his knock. She was a round-faced woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. When Elias explained his situation, keeping the details vague but emphasizing the urgency, she didn't hesitate to help. "Poor little mite," she cooed, taking Little Hawk into her experienced arms. "Don't you worry, Mr. Moore. I raised 6 of my own. This little one will be just fine with me while you see to your business." Elias handed over the bag with Little Hawk's bottles and clean cloths, watching as Mrs. Peterson settled the baby in a worn rocking chair by her kitchen stove. The warmth and homey smells of baking bread made it easier to leave him there, though his arms felt strangely empty as he walked back out into the cold. The courthouse stood at the center of town, its red brick walls and white columns an attempt at dignity among the frontier buildings. Elias stomped mud from his boots in the entrance hall, straightened his coat, and made his way to the clerk's office. His lockbox felt heavy under his arm, weighted with more than just paper and metal. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger. "Can I help you?" "I need to see Judge Wilson," Elias said firmly. "It's regarding a false arrest and an attempted land seizure by the railroad company." Something in his tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because the clerk didn't dismiss him. Instead, he disappeared through a polished wooden door and returned moments later, gesturing for Elias to follow. Judge Wilson's chambers were warm and smelled of pipe tobacco. The judge himself was older than Elias expected, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He listened without interruption as Elias laid out the situation: King's arrival with his sick child, the deputy's harassment, and finally the arrest, and the railroad's sudden claim about unpaid taxes. "I have every receipt right here, Your Honor," Elias said, opening his lockbox. He laid out the papers in neat chronological order on the judge's desk. "And this letter from Captain Morrison speaks to King's character and his history of preventing cattle theft, not committing it." Judge Wilson picked up the captain's letter first, reading it carefully through wire-rimmed spectacles. His expression remained neutral, but Elias noticed him nodding slightly at certain points. When he finished, he examined each tax receipt with the same careful attention. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about the railroad's methods," the judge said finally, setting the papers down. "They seem to think having money means they can write their own laws." He leaned back in his chair, studying Elias. "You've taken considerable risk and trouble to help this man and his child." "It was the right thing to do, Your Honor," Elias replied simply. The judge's mouth twitched in what might have been approval. "Well, these documents certainly cast doubt on both the theft accusation and the tax claim. I'll set a hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I'll have the sheriff bring Mr. Hawk from the jail." He picked up a bell from his desk and rang it, bringing the clerk hurrying back. "Write up the order for a hearing, James, and send word to the sheriff about the prisoner." "Thank you, Your Honor," Elias said, gathering his papers carefully back into the lockbox. "Don't thank me yet," Judge Wilson warned. "The railroad's lawyer will be there, and he's a slippery one. But we'll hear all sides and see where the truth lies." The sun was setting by the time Elias made his way back to the boarding house, casting long shadows between the buildings. His body ached from days of hard riding and tension, but there was still one more person to care for before he could rest. He found Mrs. Peterson in her sitting room, Little Hawk sleeping peacefully in a borrowed cradle. "He's been fed and changed," she whispered. "Poor thing was exhausted, but he's a good baby, barely fussed at all." Elias sank into the creaky rocking chair beside the cradle, feeling his own exhaustion settle deep in his bones. Mrs. Peterson brought him a bowl of hot stew and fresh bread, which he ate gratefully while keeping one eye on the sleeping child. As darkness fell outside the windows, Elias rocked slowly in the chair, watching Little Hawk's peaceful breathing. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were safe and warm. And there was hope for justice. He found himself humming softly, one of the lullabies he'd heard King play on his flute, until his own eyes grew heavy with needed sleep. The county courthouse filled quickly the next morning, townsfolk crowding into the cramped gallery benches. Winter sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in pale beams. Elias sat at the simple wooden table on the right, his lockbox and papers arranged neatly before him. The railroad's lawyer, Harlan Briggs, occupied the left table, his expensive suit and polished boots a stark contrast to Elias's plain attire. King was brought in by the sheriff, his wrists still bound. Despite 3 days in jail, he carried himself with quiet dignity. His eyes found Elias immediately, asking a silent question. Elias gave a small nod. Little Hawk was safe with Mrs. Peterson. Judge Wilson entered, and the room rose. After taking his seat behind the elevated desk, he adjusted his spectacles and surveyed the crowded courtroom. This hearing concerns 2 matters: the arrest warrant for Samuel Hawk and the railroad's claim against Elias Moore's property. Mr. Briggs, you may present your case first. The railroad lawyer stood with a flourish. Your Honor, we're simply trying to protect valuable property rights. Mr. Hawk was identified by multiple witnesses stealing cattle from railroad-contracted ranches. As for Mr. Moore's land, our records indicate significant tax delinquency. The railroad has a legitimate interest in acquiring properties vital to planned expansion. Briggs continued for several minutes, his voice growing increasingly theatrical as he described the railroad's plans for progress and prosperity. Several times he gestured toward Deputy Norris, who sat stiffly in the front row. His usual swagger diminished under the judge's steady gaze. When Briggs finally finished, Judge Wilson turned to Elias. Mr. Moore, your response? Elias stood slowly, his hands steady as he lifted his documents. Your Honor, I have here every tax receipt for the past 5 years, each one stamped and dated by the county office. He handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. As for the accusations against King, Mr. Hawk, I have a letter from Captain James Morrison of the United States Cavalry, testifying to Mr. Hawk's character and his history of preventing cattle theft while serving as a scout. The judge examined each document carefully, while the courtroom remained silent. Finally, he looked up. Deputy Norris, approach the bench. Norris moved forward, his boots scuffing on the wooden floor. The judge held up the arrest warrant. Deputy, who provided the witness statement supporting this warrant? Well, Your Honor, we had reports from... Norris trailed off, his confidence cracking. The railroad's agent said, Did you personally interview these witnesses? No, Your Honor. Did you verify the alleged theft occurred on the dates claimed? Norris shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Briggs assured me the paperwork was in order. The judge's expression hardened. So you issued a warrant and arrested a man based solely on the railroad's word, without conducting any independent investigation? A murmur rose from the gallery. Norris's face reddened, but he had no response. Judge Wilson set the papers down with deliberate care. I've heard and seen enough. This court rules as follows. First, the arrest warrant for Samuel Hawk is void, having been issued without proper cause or investigation. He is to be released immediately. He turned his stern gaze to Briggs. Second, the attempted seizure of Elias Moore's property is declared illegal and invalid. Mr. Moore's tax payments are fully documented and current. Spontaneous applause broke out among the townspeople in the gallery. The judge rapped his gavel once, restoring order, but didn't hide his own slight smile. Sheriff, remove Mr. Hawk's restraints, he ordered. Mr. Briggs, I suggest you advise your railroad clients that this court takes a dim view of using legal mechanisms to harass law-abiding citizens. This hearing is adjourned. Elias barely heard the scraping of chairs and murmur of voices as people began filing out. He gathered his papers quickly, nodding thanks to the judge, then hurried from the courthouse toward Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. His heart felt lighter with each step. The matron had Little Hawk ready, wrapped snugly against the morning chill. I heard the cheering from here, she said, smiling as she handed over the baby. "Good news travels fast in a small town." Elias carried Little Hawk to the jail, arriving just as King emerged into the winter sunlight. He still wore the same clothes he'd been arrested in, and 3 days of stubble darkened his jaw. But his eyes lit up at the sight of his son, and they met in the middle of the muddy street, clasping hands firmly. King's other hand gently touched his son's cheek, checking him over with a father's care. Relief and gratitude passed between the two men without need for words. They had won more than just a legal victory. They had preserved a chance for justice, for family, for a future where a man's word and honest work still counted for something in this changing land. After the courthouse victory, Mrs. Peterson welcomed them back to her boarding house, insisting on preparing a hot supper. The dining room was modest but warm, with a crackling fire in the corner stove and simple checkered curtains framing windows that looked out on the darkening street. King sat with Little Hawk nestled in one arm while he ate beef stew with his free hand. The baby was content, occasionally reaching for the spoon with curious fingers. Elias watched them from across the worn wooden table, something settling deep in his chest, a feeling of rightness he hadn't experienced since losing his own family years ago. "Been thinking," King said quietly, breaking their comfortable silence, "about where to raise Little Hawk." He paused, stirring his stew thoughtfully. "Need somewhere safe, somewhere he won't have to always be looking over his shoulder or running from false accusations." Elias nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. The constant threat of persecution, the exhaustion of always being viewed with suspicion. It was no way to raise a child. "These past weeks," Elias began, then cleared his throat against the sudden tightness there. "Having you both at the ranch, it's brought life back to the place, made it feel like home again." He met King's eyes steadily. "You've become family to me." King's expression softened, and he glanced down at his sleeping son before looking back at Elias. "We felt it too." They finished their meal in peaceful quiet, listening to the gentle ticking of Mrs. Peterson's wall clock and the occasional passing of wagons outside. That night they shared a simple room upstairs, Little Hawk sleeping soundly in a drawer padded with blankets between their beds. The next morning dawned clear and cool. They spent the early hours purchasing supplies, flour, coffee, dried beans, and ammunition. King selected a new warm blanket for Little Hawk, while Elias haggled over the price of leather for repairs. By mid-morning, they had the wagon loaded and ready for the journey home. The trip back to the ranch took 3 full days, their pace slowed by the spring thaw. Creek beds that had been frozen solid on their journey to town now ran high and fast with meltwater. At each crossing, they carefully tested the depth before guiding the wagon through, King walking alongside to steady the horses while Elias drove. Their first night's camp was in a sheltered hollow, where long grass provided good grazing for the horses. King built a small fire while Elias prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork. Little Hawk lay on a blanket nearby, fascinated by the dancing flames and letting out delighted giggles at each pop and crackle from the burning wood. Under a sky scattered with brilliant stars, King began sharing stories of his childhood in the high desert. He spoke of learning to track from his father, of summer monsoons that turned dry arroyos into rushing rivers, of nights spent listening to tribal elders tell tales of their ancestors. Elias listened intently, seeing the land through new eyes as King described the hidden beauty of places most settlers considered barren. The second evening found them camped beside a clear spring. While Little Hawk slept wrapped snugly in his new blanket, King taught Elias more Apache words, their quiet laughter mixing with the spring's gentle burble. The night air was cool but not bitter, winter's harsh edge finally dulling into spring's promise. On the third day, as afternoon sun warmed their backs, they finally crested the familiar hill overlooking the ranch. The sight of the buildings below, the sturdy cabin, the barn with its newly repaired door, the corral where cattle grazed peacefully, brought an unexpected wave of emotion to both men. They paused there on the hilltop, taking in the view. Little Hawk stirred in his sling against King's chest, making soft cooing sounds as a warm breeze ruffled his dark hair. Elias glanced at his companions, seeing his own feelings reflected in King's expression. This was more than just a return to shelter or safety. This was a homecoming in the deepest sense, a return to a place where they could be family, where they belonged. "Welcome home," Elias said softly, the words carrying easily in the clear mountain air. King's hand found Elias's shoulder, squeezing gently in silent acknowledgement. Little Hawk reached out with tiny fingers, grasping at sunbeams. Together, they started down the hill toward the waiting ranch, their shadows merging into one long line across the greening spring grass. Back at the ranch, spring's warmth began to soften the frozen ground. The men settled into a steady rhythm of work, focusing first on repairing the winter-damaged corrals. King's skilled hands made quick work of replacing rotted posts, while Elias measured and cut fresh rails. They worked side by side through the lengthening days, their movements becoming naturally synchronized. Little Hawk watched from a makeshift pen of blankets in the shade, batting at wooden toys King had carved for him. His delighted squeals punctuated their work, drawing smiles from both men. The baby was growing stronger daily, his cheeks filling out with health, his grip becoming more certain. They decided to delay the cattle drive until summer, knowing the spring thaw would make the mountain passes treacherous. Instead, they focused on strengthening the ranch's infrastructure and preparing for the warmer months ahead. King taught Elias traditional Apache methods for predicting weather patterns, while Elias shared his knowledge of cattle breeding and range management. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in deep oranges and purples, King finished securing the last corral post. He tested its strength with a firm shake, then turned to Elias, who was gathering their tools. "Need to ask you something," King said, his deep voice carrying a note of unusual hesitation. Elias straightened, giving King his full attention. The taller man's face was thoughtful, serious. "These past months," King continued, choosing his words carefully, "you've been more than just shelter to us, more than a friend." He glanced toward Little Hawk, who was dozing in his blanket nest. "The boy needs two fathers, a proper family." His eyes met Elias's directly. "Would you stay on as his other father? Be my partner in raising him?" The question hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Elias felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought of the lonely years after losing his own child, the empty rooms that had echoed with absence. He thought of how these past months had filled those spaces with new life, new purpose. "Yes," Elias answered, his voice rough but certain. "Yes, I would be honored." King's face softened with relief and joy. He reached out, clasping Elias's shoulder with a warm, strong hand. The touch conveyed everything words couldn't: gratitude, trust, family. Together, they walked to where Little Hawk lay. King lifted the drowsy child, and they moved to stand at the fence line, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the distant mountains. Behind them, lamplight spilled from the cabin windows, casting a warm glow across the yard. The evening air carried the rich scent of thawing earth mixed with pine, a promise of renewal. Little Hawk stirred, becoming more alert. He reached out, one small hand grasping King's finger, the other finding Elias's. The men exchanged glances over the child's head, both recognizing the perfect symmetry of the moment. Elias's mind drifted back to that bitter January night, when a desperate knock had broken the silence of his solitary life. He had been alone then, wrapped in old grief, going through the motions of survival. Now, standing here with his new family, he offered a silent prayer of thanksgiving. The Lord's mercy, he realized, often arrived in unexpected ways, through strangers seeking help in the dark, through a child's need, through the gradual building of trust between two unlikely allies. The dying light caught the silver in King's dark hair, the gentle curve of Little Hawk's cheek, the weathered wood of the fence they'd rebuilt together. These simple things now held profound meaning. They were the pieces of a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by shared struggle, by daily acts of faith and care. This, Elias thought, was how the Lord worked. Not always through grand gestures or obvious signs, but through the quiet glory of strangers becoming family, of empty places being filled, of love taking root in the most unexpected soil. As darkness settled fully around them, Little Hawk yawned and snuggled closer between his fathers. The three of them stood there a moment longer, bound together by something stronger than circumstance or convenience. They had found each other through need, but they had chosen to become family through love. Finally, King spoke softly. Time to head in. The words carried the weight of permanence, of home, of belonging. Elias nodded, and they turned toward the welcoming light of their cabin. Behind them, the mountains stood as silent witnesses to this new beginning, this family forged in the unlikeliest of ways. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.